We're up to Daf Hey Amid Beis, but first the last line on Amid Aleph. Amar Rab Elazar Reb Chanina, and the Gemara tells us that Rabbi Elazar relates the following story about Rebbe. Number one, Rebbe Nata Netia B'Purim. He would plant on Purim. He wasn't choshish for any sort of Iser Malacha. B'Rochatz B'Krona Shel Tzipore B'Shiv'asar B'Tam. And he bathed out in the public area, meaning in a marketplace of the city of Tzipore, when there was Hiluch Kronos, when there were caravans going through the city of Tzipore, and this was on the fast of Shavuos B'Tammuz, and Rebbe did this publicly in order to publicize the heter that you're permitted to bathe on Tammuz, on Shavuos B'Tammuz. The reason for this is whenever it's a Zman she'en gzeres al Yisrael, it's like Shalom, then you don't have to be machmer with an Isur Chitz on Tainis, except for Tisha B'Av. Furthermore, the Ode, another Dvar Heter that Rebbe was knowing, Shabikesh Lakar es Tisha B'Av. Now, what does that mean, Lakar es Tisha B'Av? It sounds like it means he was Mavatal Tisha B'Av. That's what he wanted to do, at least. Some of disagreed. But that's impossible. I mean, we have a mission at the end of Tainis called Ochel B'Shos Tisha B'Av, Ein Roa Ben Chamas Yerushalayim. And we have a general principle, Ein Bez the Yochel Avatal Divrei Chavero El King Gadol B'Menu B'Chacham B'Minyan. So what was Rebbe's intention? Here we have two possibilities. One is he wanted to mevatel the Iser of Inui on the Tainis of Tisha B'Av. In other words, we shouldn't be machmir in Tisha B'Av more than other Tainios and institute an Iser Achitzas. Or alternatively, he wasn't being okay the kvius of Tisha B'Av as a day of both fasting and he was only want to be okay the day of the 9th of Av. And his opinion, which in fact is the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan, that we should be koveh Tisha B'Av on the 10th of Av, because that's when the majority of the strafe of the Beis Hamikdash took place. Although Hodulo, the Chacham did not agree with regard to Tisha B'Av. Omer Lefano, Rabbi Abba Bar Zav, so that when Rabbi Elazar recorded this, transmitted this story about Rebbe, he got a response from Rabbi Abba Bar Zavta, who said, Rabbi, my Rebbe, meaning Rabbi Elazar, lo kacha, you're not telling the story properly. When you say that Rebbe wanted to be okay the fast Tisha B'Av, that's not really accurate. Ella, but what was the Masechet Shahaya? In that year, Tisha B'Av Chaliyos B'Shabbos. Tisha B'Av fell on a Shabbos. Udechinu li'achar Shabbos. Therefore, they postponed the fast until Sunday. And that's what Rebbe wanted to disagree with. The Omar Rebbe Hol v'nitcha, once you've already pushed off Tisha B'Av from its time, its right time, we should push it off on that day, and there would be no Tisha B'Av on that day. When Tisha B'Av coincides with holds, there's no Tisha B'Av. Lo hodu lo chachamim, and the chachamim disagreed. Now, when Rabbi Elazar heard that correction from Rabbi Abba, he made the following comment. He says, Kari alei, he called upon himself the following pasuk. He applied the following pasuk in Koheles Perek Daled, Tovim Ashnayim and Echad. Notice when you learn B'Chavrusa, if you make a mistake, then your friend, your colleague will correct you. It do. If I hadn't learned this together with Rabbi Abba Bar Zavda, then I would have made a mistake in terms of the story, exactly what happened in the episode of Rebbe. But now that we're Shnayim, with two is better than one, then he corrected me, and it's really good that now I came to the emes. Gemara asks for Rebbe, Heichi Natan Netia B'Purim. How could it be that Rebbe permitted, and he himself would work on Purim? I'll tell you, Rabbi Yosef. We have a brayso of Rabbi Yosef, and we're interpreting in this brayso the pasuk in Esther Tes, Osim es Yom Arbasa Chodesh Adar Simcha u'Mishta v'Yontiv. Simcha, says the brayso, Malamed she Asurim v'Hespi Tainis, the days of Purim, that's the 14th to 15th, generated Itzer Hespi Tainis, because that would be Mamayit to Simcha. And then it says Mishta. These days are days of Mishta. Malamed sha'asur b'tainis, that you're not allowed to fast on Purim. So there's an Isur Hesped and an Isur Tainis. But the pasuk says not only did they make these days as days of Simcha Mishta, it also says V'yont. V'yontif, what is that established? Malamed sha'asur b'asiyas malach. We don't do malach on Purim. So how is it possible? Rebbe did malach on Purim, meleches netiyah. It's a yontif, and it's also b'asiyas malach. And the Gemara answers, Ela Rabbi Bar Arbeis Arhav. The case was that Rebbe had a chiyuv to observe Purim on Yudalit. In other words, he lived in an open city, which was not Mukaf Choma, and he fulfilled his mitzvah Purim on Yudalit. And when did he plant a tree? Bechameisar Nota. It was on the 15th, which was not his Purim. And the Gemara now is going to really analyze where Rebbe lived and was he in a city that was Mukaf Chom or not, and what's the status of Tveria. But before we get into this, let's just point out that it seems that Rebbe didn't do a big deal. I mean, Purim passed on Yudalit and he didn't do any malacha. He only did malacha on the 15th. So what's the big deal? What's the finish here? But the answer might be that since the 15th is also a day of Purim for everybody, and it's a day that generates an Isur Hesped, therefore you might have thought that maybe there's an Isur Malach on the 15th as well. The Gemara asks, Aini, is it really true that Rebbe lived in a place that was open, an open city? For Rebbe b'Tveria Avi, Rebbe lived in Tveria, Tveria b'Kefes Chomi Mos Yeshua ben Nun. Isn't it true that the city of Tveria was surrounded by a wall way back in time of Yeshua ben Nun? So therefore his Purim would have been on the 15th. Gemara says, no, we have to answer Ella, Rebbe Bar Chameisar Havi. Rebbe, as a citizen of Tveria, would celebrate Purim on the 15th. But V'chinata Bar Beisar Havi. The story was that he planted on the 14th. And this is not his Purim, it's Purim for the present, but he was a krach, a mukafes chom. You're assuming that certainly the wall around the city of Tveria dates back to the time of Yeshua ben Nun, and therefore you cannot do malacha on the 15th because it's the day of Purim, but rather Rebbe did malacha on the 14th. This is a real suffix. Izkiah, one of the great Amoraim, Kari b'Tveria ba'Arbeisar v'Chameshus. He, Chizkiah, would read the Megillah both on the 14th and the 15th in the city of Tveria. And why? There was Safkali, he had a suffix. Imukefes chom imos Yeshua ben Nuni ilo. So where it says Lechizkiah Masapkali Rebbe Pshitali. Rebbe knew for sure it wasn't an issue. That Tveria was certainly Mukafes Chom Imos Yoshua, therefore his Purim was on the 15th, and he did Malacha on the 14th. Now, this is a very interesting halacha that in Safek we require a double Purim, a double Kriyas HaMegillah, both on the 14th and the 15th, like in the case of Tveria according to Chizkiah. Why is that so? I mean, usually we say Safek Rabban L'Kula, and there are two basic answers. There's an answer based on the Ran that you don't say Safek Rabban L'Kula if it means that you're going to be okay the mitzvah quietly, that Tveria would not have Kriyas HaMegillah. Neither on the 14th because it's Safek 15th, neither the 15th because it's Safek maybe it's Kriyas HaMegillah on the 14th. Cannot be oker a mitzvah d'Rabbanan based on Safek Rabban L'Kula. Another answer is that of the Turei that Megillah is called Midivrei Kabbalah. It's upgraded to a status similar to a Derais, and therefore we apply the din of Safek L'Chum. The Gemara asks, is it really true that it was Pashut Rebbe that Tveria was Mukef Yeshua and Purim is on Tesvav? And let's grant that it was Pshitale. Even if I grant you that it was Pshitale. Is Mishari, are you allowed to do Malach on the 14th? Vaksiv, in the list enumerated in Megillah's Tainus, in the 12th parak, it says, Es Yom Arbasar, Ves Yom Yomi the Puraya, both the 14th, the 15th are days of Purim. The Lola Mispid Behu, there's no Hesped, and we'll see what about Isa Malach. But in any event, there are 2 days of Purim, Yudalid and Tesva, which are both days of Yantiv, according to Megillah's Tainus. V'yamar Rav and Rava, it says that the Isser Hesped Tainus is already written in Megillah's Esther. Why do we need a Megillah's Tainus to tell me that which is in Megillah's Esther? Lo nitzcha el lesers yom zeh, shel zeh bazeh v'shel zeh bazeh. And we're talking about the fact that Mukafim are enjoined from Hesped v'Tainus even on Yudal, and the Prosim are enjoined from Hesped v'Tainus even on Tesvav. Lesser es shel zeh bazeh v'es shel zeh bazeh. And therefore, even if Rebbe was partial that Tveria is Mukefes Chol Mosi Yoshua, nevertheless, it's clear from Megillah's Tainus, the dinim of Purim and the Isurim that are generated therein apply both to Yudal Tesvav, both to Bnei HaMukafim and to Bnei HaProsim. And therefore, the Isur Malacha in Tveria Mukefes would apply, even if I know it's Mukefes, even on Yudal. So how could Rebbe allow himself to do Malacha on Yudal? The Gemara says, Hani, really, when do we say that that list in Megillah's Tainus generates an Isur Zeh Bazeh Bazeh Bazeh, both the Krachim on the 14th and the Prosim on the 15th? That's only as far as Hesped v'Tainus. Aval Malach, as far as Isur Malacha is concerned, Yom Echad v'Sulo. There's only one day of the Isur Malacha, which means for the Prosim on 14th, for the Mukafim on the 15th. Therefore, it was mutter for Rebbe as a citizen of an Ir Mukefes Chol Tveria to be notea on the 14th. So the Gemara says, Eini, is this really true that there's no Isur Malacha beyond one particular day, whether it's the 14th or the 15th? We have a story of Rav Chazia, Lahu Gavra, Davika Shadi Kisna. Rav saw a person who was planting Pishtan on the light day, and he was Makalel, and he put a whammy on. And as a result of this whammy, below Tzomach Kisna, his cotton or his linen didn't grow. The flax didn't take a root because of the power of Rav's cloth. Anyway, it seems from this Maisa that there's an Isur Malacha everywhere, both on Yudalit and Tesvav. So Gemara answers, Hasan Bar Yomi. Maybe the situation was that it was his day. The Maisa was that that person was Orei Pishtan on the day of Purim in that place. And that's why Rav put a whammy on. But if it's not his Purim, because he's a Yadalit and it's Tesvav or the other way around, then there's no Isur Malacha. Now the Gemara offers an alternative answer to explain how Rebbe was notea and atia on Purim. Rabba brayed the Rav Amar Afilu Teviyomeh. Even if it was Rebbe's day of Purim, Rebbe held that Hesped v'Tainus Kablei Alei. The people of Israel accepted the Isur Hesped v'Tainus, but Malach, the Isur Malach, lo Kibbul Alei. They never accepted upon themselves the Isur Malach, and if a Purim is mutter b'Malach. And I'll prove it to you. The Mikara Ksiv, in the pasuk that deals with the beginning of the Takana, in that very year in which the nest took place, it says Simcha u'mishpeh v'yad l'basov. But when the pasuk later on, in the same chapter, addresses the Kabbalas Yisrael Doros, it says Lasos osam yimei mishta v'simcha, and Yontif is omitted. Ilu Yontif lo ksiv. Apparently, Klal Yisrael never agreed to accept upon themselves for all generations an Isur Malacha. So Gemara asks V'Ela, if you tell me there's no Isur Malacha on Purim, Rav, my time of light Gavra, why did Rav put a whammy on that person that was Orei Pishtan on Purim? He didn't violate any Isur. And the Gemara answers, this is a case which comes under this the Isur Malacha of Dvar Mutarim, that technically, according to the strict letter law, it's mutar. You're allowed to do malach on Purim, lo kibbul alayu, as we said. But Nagu Acherim Bahem Isa. Others took upon themselves a prohibition of malacha on Purim, was self-imposed, voluntarily accepted. And you're not allowed to do malacha in the presence of people who are knowing Isa. They have a minigli Isa. So this person who did malacha, and Rav got very upset with him, put a whammy on him, he was doing a malacha in a place where the minig was, the local custom was not to do malacha on Purim. But the Asri, the Rebbe, lo no, in the place where Rebbe lived, they were not knowing an Isa malach on Purim, and therefore he had carte blanche right to be notea and netia on Purim. Ibai saying, well, the Gemara offers an alternative answer. The olam, no, you could say that in the makom of Rebbe there was a minute to abstain from malach on Purim, but Rebbe netia shall simcha. Let's get the facts on the ground. What exactly was the case? The scenario. It was a netia shel simcha. And Purim is a day of simcha. So even though there's an Isa malacha, that's because malacha is hesech hadas, and it diverts your attention away from the simcha. But if you have a netia shel simcha, then even though technically it comes under malacha, but it's not prohibited, because the malacha, the Isa malacha in that minhag is not begeder malacha per se, but rather begeder hesech hadas. So the fact that it's a malacha and classified as such, that's relevant, obviously, not relevant to Purim, because there's no Isa malacha. The Isa is a malacha that generates hesech hadas, and therefore undermines your simcha. But if you had a malacha which would enhance the simcha, and the malacha itself inherently has a kiyum simcha, then it's perfectly aligned with Purim. Kirisnan, as we learned in the Mishnah in Tainus on Daf Yud Beis, Avru Eilu, right? There was an Atzirus because the rains didn't come down, and Bez made a k'ter of 13 fasts. V'lo nanu, and there was no response from the heavens. The rains did not come down. In such a case, mematim b'masu mat b'binyan of v'netiyah be'eris and v'nesur. So the tzibur should reduce and limit, restrict its masu matan, its building, its planting, eris and nesuin. All this should be reduced because it's a very sad period of time. There's no geshamim, even after the 13th fast. We're waiting desperately for geshamim. V'tanei Allah, we have a brisa that explains that Mishnah is binyan, that which the Mishnah prohibits binyan, that's binyan shel simcha. That's what you're not allowed to do during that period of time, because the simcha of that binyan is antithetical. You build a base chasidus for a wedding. That's antithetical to the solemn nature of those days. Netiya, when it says mematim b'netiya, is b'netiya shel simcha. It's not any netiya. It's only a netiya shel simcha, which is antithetical to the spirit, the solemn spirit of that time. Because that time period, royal and lino kinizufim be'avelus. It's almost a miktas avelus. And therefore we want to reduce simcha. The Brisa says, Ezu binyan shel simcha, zeh abona beis chasus no. Right? He's marrying off his son, and he builds a chuppah, a bias, which is going to be like a chuppah. That's already simcha shel mishta. That's already binyan shel simcha. It's not appropriate time in which we're in a zufim and we're in a quasi avelus state. Ezu netiya shel simcha, zeh hanotea avurniki shel malachim. This is an elon which has a very heavy foliage and offers a great deal of shade. And they bend over the branches, over the beams, to create a great deal of shade. And that's where the kings will eat, under this like gazebo kind of thing, during the hot months of the sun, when the sun is beating down. And then misaneg, there's an extra tainu with all sorts of simcha. And these tainios are yemei tzar, and therefore there's an isur binyan and netiya shel simcha, as we described. But other binyan and netiya, is not prohibited. And so too on Purim in the opposite, which is a day of Simcha, then a malach of Torah and Tsar, which is antithetical to Simcha, but it's not antithetical to a day of Tsar, was never prohibited. So, for example, such a netiyah is mutter on Purim because it doesn't undermine the Simcha of Purim. And therefore, Rebbe was notea a netiyah shel Simcha on Purim. Gufa, let's go back to Chizkiah. Chizkiah Kari b'Tiveria Barbasar u'b'Chamisha imu kefes chomo v'yemos Yeshua ben Nun ilo. So the Gemara says, "Umi mesafkala." Is it really so that there's a suffix that Chizkiah didn't know the status of Tveria, Milsa Tveria? Aksiv, it's pretty explicit in the pasuk in that section, that parsha, where there is a listing of cities in Nachlas Shevet Naftali. It says, "V'ori mivtzar hatzidim, Sar v'Chamas, Rakas v'Chineres, v'Kaimalon," and we know that Rakas is Tveria. So we see that already at the time of Yoshua, Tveria was a fortified city, which means it was Mukefes Choma, and that's why it's called Ore Mivtzar. Ore Mivtzar means a walled city. So then it's explicit in the pasuk that Rakas, meaning Tveria, is Mukefes Chomos Yoshua ben Nun. So for sure the time for reading the Megillah would be the 15th. So why was he in doubt? And where it says, "Haining time Mesafkale Mishum V'Chad Gisa Shura B'Yom HaHavetz," that although there was a wall around that surrounded the city of Tveria, as we saw it was Ari Mivsar, but on one side, it was only a wall on three sides. On the fourth side, it was a natural kind of choma. It was the Yam Kineres. There was no actual structure of a wall made of stone. And Chizkiah vacillated and was in doubt about the status of the Yam. Does the water of the Yam have an upgraded status as a Hekif Choma? Because we need a Hekif Choma on all four sides. And that's where Chizkiah was confused about Tveria. So Gemara says, I'm going to prove from a brisa with regard to the parsha at the end of Vayikra of Geulas Karka, which is in the case of someone who sold a piece of real estate in a city that's Orei Chovan, a walled city. And from this brisa, I'm going to prove to you that Hekef Hayam, that section which doesn't have a wall but is contiguous to the Yam, is not considered a Choma, and we'll certainly read the Megillah on Yudal. Sanya, we learned in a brisa with regard to Gulas Karka, in the case again of a Mocher Bate or a Choma, this is in Vayikra Chafei, that if the Mocher was not Goel Abayis within 12 months of the sale, then Vakama Abayis Shebeir Shalo Choma, Litzmitus, Akona, Otso, Lidorotso, Lo Yetzibiyomet. It means that after 12-month period, he can no longer, he, meaning the seller, no longer redeem his field against the will of the buyer, but rather it's already litzmitus in the buyer's position. And it says, Asher lo chom. And what are we going to derive from the extra words, Asher lo choma? This city is not considered an ir mukefes chom, unless it has a choma unto itself. Lo Shur Igar. What is Shur Igar? Shechomsa, its choma is Gagosera. In other words, you're talking about a city that is surrounded with batim. And the outer walls of these batim that surround the city, they are the Chomas Ha'ir. And that Hekev, Velo shur igar is not considered active choma. Fine. Now the Brisa continues in the parsha of Mocher Bayis Be'ir She'ena Mukefes Choma, and it says in the pasuk Ridal Pasuk Bate Achatzerim Asher Ein Lahem Choma Saviv Al Sdei Ha'aretz Chashev Geulat Dialo Ubayovel Yetze. So let's emphasize the word Saviv, Asher Ein Lahem Chova Saviv. From the word Saviv, we derive that these cities are not considered Mukafos Choma unless they have Mukafos Choma Saviv. Saviv means the city is completely, totally surrounded on all four sides by a Choma. Prat, to exclude Litveria, Sheyama Chomasa, that on one side it only has a Choma from the Yam. It doesn't have a natural structured wall made of stone. And it's not considered Bnuya Saviv, and therefore it's not considered Mukefes Choma. But we see explicitly in this price, it's not considered Mukefes Choma, because the Yam is not considered a Choma. So why did Chizkiah think that maybe in Tver you have to read the Megillah on the 15th? And the Gemara says, Choma, when the Torah says Choma explicitly, and only in that city that has a Choma surrounding it, there is a halach that we give him 12 months, etc., to redeem its field, the mocher. Lo misafka. Chizkiah would have no, certainly Tveria would not have a din of an ir mukefes choma as far as the law bate ari choma is concerned, because on one side it's completely exposed, there is no choma, there's no actual man-made wall of stone, only the sad yam, and we derive from saviv that we need that it should be completely saviv with a that was built by man. However, there might be a different din entirely with regard to Mikra Megillah. There it doesn't say anywhere choma, it just says prazim. And therefore the suffix of Chizkiah was my prazim, umay mukafim tsivi abi Mikra Megillah. What are your definitions of prazim versus mukafim with regard to the Chiyuv Megillah? And there are two ways of going. Mishum dahani migalu, dahani lo migalu. Maybe the difference between a prazi city and a mukaf city is because, with regard to the prazim, it's megulim, totally exposed without any choma. Dahani lo miglu, where mukafim are covered around by the chova. And if we're going to accept that definition, then Tveria nami migle. Tveria is actually exposed from the Tzadayam. So let's say you were coming into Tveria by ship, and you docked in the docking place of the city of Tveria, then you have immediate access into the city. Nothing is holding you back. Oh, Dilma, should we say, no, the difference between a prazi and a mukaf is mishum dahani mignu, dahani lo mignu. Question of protection against the enemy. The Tveria nami mignu. Tveria has a protection from that side of the Yam. And it would seem that we're not worried about a maritime attack, meaning that the enemies are going to come into Tveria from the waterway. And therefore Tveria is a secure city, and that's what we need in order to establish that Tveria has a reading of Megillah on the 15th as an Ir Mukefes Choma. If it's a question of Migalu or Lo Migalu, then Tveria is Migalu. And it would read on the 14th. If on the other hand it depends on Mignu or Lo Mignu, protected or not protected, secure or not secure, then Tveria would have a din of a secure city equal to that of an Ir Mukefes Choma, Mimos Yesh Benun, and it would read the Megillah on the 15th. The Gemara tells the following story. Rav Asi, Kari Megillah Behutzal, Be'arbasar Chamisha B'Mesafkale. Rav Asi had a suffix in regard to the status of Hutzal. Is it Mukefes Choma Motzi Yotzu Benun or not? And therefore he read the Megillah on both the 14th and 15th. Ika the Omar, Yesh, Shomar Shmu Zubalash Nacher. There is another transmission. This Shmomar Avasi, Hai Utzum the base Binyamin, Mukefes Chom Mos Yeshua, which means the city of Hutzal in the Nachla Binyamin is certainly a city that's Mukefes Chom Mos Yeshua, and therefore it reads on the 15th. Amar Rav Yochanan, Avina Talia, when I was a youngster, Amina Milza, I said something, Tishaelna li Saboy. And after I said it, I asked a question about it to the Zkanim, to the elders of the city. And on the top of the Vav, V'ishtakach Kavosi, and I was machavein to the Divrei Zkanim, and they agreed with me. And this is what I said to them. Mas, which is a city mentioned in Sefer Yoshua Perek Yutes, though Tveria. That name Hamas is an acronym for Tveria. V'lo menikra Shma Hamas. Why is Tveria called Hamas? Al Shum Chame Tveria, because of Chame Tveria, right? Those hot springs. So Hamas means chom, eat. Tveria is a hot city because it has Chame Tveria. On the other hand, Rakats, also mentioned in the Pasuk in Yoshua, Zo Tzipori. That's a nickname for Tzipori. V'lo menikra Shma. Why is Tzipori called Rakas? Mishum de Medalia, Keraksa Denara. It is a lifted up city on a mountain, like the Sfas Hanor Shegavoa Me'anor, like the bank of the river, which is lifted above the river itself, the water. Kineret, again listed there in Sefer Yeshua, Zu Ginosar. So what we call today Ginosar. Paloma Nikrishma Kineret, Mishum de Mesike Peri Kekola de Kineret. So we use the word Kineret in the Bible because it's got these very, very sweet fruits that grow, and he compares it to kola de kinri, the kol, the sound that comes from a kinar. That's a description of the fruits of this city, which we call Ginosar, that are so sweet. And now Rava is going to object to the words of Rabbi Yochanan that Rekes is Sipori, that Rakas is Sipori. Okay, then this is where we're going to end for today. Omar Rava Mi'ika Lamandi Omar, here on the top of Daf Vav Omera. Thank you, and have a great Shabbos.